Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Marshal Jonathan Mercer's life had been irrevocably altered by loss. After the passing of his beloved wife, Caroline, he decided it was time to honor her memory and his family's legacy by building a home that would stand as a beacon of hope and resilience. Choosing to work with trusted architects and contractors, Jonathan embarked on constructing a contemporary villa on his ancestral acres, a pristine piece of land passed down through generations. Every detail of the villa was meticulously planned. From the sleek, energy-efficient design to the sustainable materials used throughout the residence, the project was a testament to modern engineering and heartfelt remembrance. All permits were secured, and every municipal code was followed to the letter. Jonathan prided himself on his adherence to the rules. His new home was both a personal sanctuary and a model of architectural compliance. Throughout the construction phase, Jonathan was buoyed by a sense of purpose. Despite the lingering sorrow of losing Caroline, each brick laid and every beam installed was a step toward reclaiming his future. His days were long, filled with visits to the site where he oversaw progress and discussed design innovations with his team. In those moments, he felt that, through this creation, Caroline's spirit continued to nurture his dreams. Yet, even as Jonathan sought solace in the tangible fruits of his labor, whispers began to spread through the local community. Questions surfaced about zoning boundaries and building standards, even though nothing was out of order with his paperwork. For Jonathan, the clarity and legality of his project should have been a source of pride. Instead, uncertainty slowly crept into the air, casting an unexpected shadow over his newfound peace. Nonetheless, he remained steadfast, confident that the transparency of his process would eventually quell any concerns. The villa was soon nearing completion, a radiant symbol of the past honored and a future reclaimed. As the final touches were applied, Jonathan envisioned warm gatherings, community events, and quiet evenings where the memories of his wife would blend with hopeful anticipation for what was to come. In these quiet moments, Marshal Mercer often reflected on the duality of his journey, the grief for what was lost and the determination to forge forward. His decision to build on the very land that had carried the legacy of his family was both an act of defiance against despair and a homage to the enduring power of memory. Though his heart bore a wound that time might never fully heal, Jonathan found solace in the structure that now proudly stood on his ancestral land. Little did he know, however, that his commitment to lawful excellence and aesthetic integrity was about to encounter unforeseen challenges that would test not only his resolve but also the very principles of community governance. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and as the villa's foundation set into stone, the stage was quietly being set for events that would soon shake his world to its core. Shortly after the completion of the initial phases of his villa, Marshal Jonathan Mercer's world took an unexpected turn. In the middle of overseeing the final exterior touches, a process he had long dreamed of, the mail slot rattled, and among the usual correspondence lay an official violation notice from the local Homeowners Advisory Association, HOA. The notice, crisp and formal, cited a violation that left Jonathan utterly perplexed. The exterior paint, chosen in a hue called seaside haze, was allegedly not on the approved list. For Jonathan, who had dutifully consulted architects, secured all necessary approvals, and even personally verified every specification against municipal codes, the notice was as inexplicable as it was infuriating. He had selected seaside haze for a reason. It embodied the gentle light and timeless charm of the nearby ocean, a tribute to the serenity he so desperately sought after years of loss. Yet, here it was, branded as non-compliant by an association that, until now, had played only a peripheral role in the community's affairs. Determined to resolve the matter, Jonathan immediately began gathering his paperwork. Every permit, every design guideline, and all formal approvals were meticulously reviewed. The evidence was indisputable. His villa had been built completely in accordance with legal requirements and community standards as stipulated by the local government. The HOA's demand, it appeared, was based on an arbitrary and outdated aesthetic policy. One that seemed designed less for uniformity and more for control. As days passed, the violation notice became a focal point for heated debates at local gatherings and online forums. Neighbors began to question whether the HOA was overstepping its bounds, imposing rules that had little relevance to actual building codes. The issue quickly escalated from a mere administrative error to a matter of principle about the extent of authority held by community associations. Jonathan, however, maintained his measured approach. He penned letters and made calls, seeking clarity and rectification from the HOA board, convinced that rational dialogue would soon set things right. Despite his best efforts, responses from the HOA were vague and evasive. A representative issued a statement reiterating that all homeowners were required to adhere strictly to the approved color list, without any mention of how or why his chosen shade had been excluded. The frustration Jonathan felt grew with every unanswered query and every curt dismissal. His meticulous records and respectful insistence on fairness clashed with what he increasingly saw as an arbitrary and authoritarian exercise of power. In his quiet moments, Jonathan found himself pondering the deeper implications of this incident. Was this really just about a paint color, or was it an early indicator of deeper fractures within the community governance? His mind raced with possibilities, all tinged with a sense of injustice. The meticulous home he had built, a symbol of respect for law and order, now risked becoming a battleground for a debate on personal freedom versus rigid conformity. Determined not to let this minor yet symbolic battle tarnish his spirit, Jonathan resolved to stand firm. He reached out to experts in municipal law and community management, seeking advice on how to challenge what he believed to be an overreach by the HOA. Support began to trickle in from like-minded neighbors, many of whom shared similar concerns about overly strict regulations that stifled personal expression and creative design. Jonathan's villa, once a purely personal project of remembrance and renewal, had now inadvertently become a flashpoint in the broader debate about community autonomy and the limits of regulatory power. Every conversation, every piece of correspondence, and every glance from his neighbors reminded him that this was about much more than paint. It was about protecting the individual rights and liberties that he held dear. As the dispute gathered momentum, Jonathan's resolve hardened. With every document he reviewed and every phone call he made, he prepared for the possibility of a prolonged struggle, one that might eventually require public attention and even legal intervention. The once quiet process of home building was now interwoven with the threads of communal politics, and Marshall Mercer stood at the crossroads of personal loss, legal honor, and a fight for fairness in his community. With the violation notice still hanging over his head, Marshal Jonathan Mercer knew that a face-to-face encounter with the governing body of the Homeowners Advisory Association was inevitable. Determined to resolve the misunderstanding once and for all, he requested an immediate meeting with the board. The meeting was set at the community center, a spacious hall filled with residents and officials alike. On the day of the meeting, Jonathan arrived prepared. His organized portfolio of permits, blueprints, and correspondence rested neatly in his briefcase. Across from him sat the board members, including one particularly adamant figure, the newly named board representative, Veronica Mills. Veronica carried herself with an air of authority that bordered on rigidity, and her reputation for enforcing the community aesthetic was well known among the residents. For many, she embodied the stereotype of an overzealous enforcer of arbitrary rules. As the session commenced, tension filled the room. Jonathan began by calmly recounting how his villa had been built entirely according to approved plans and standards. He laid out his supporting documents on a table in front of him, inviting each board member to review the evidence. His voice was measured yet resolute, a man determined to defend the integrity of his work. Veronica Mills, however, was unmoved. With a dismissive wave, she challenged the validity of his arguments. The HOA guidelines exist for a reason, she argued sharply, her tone leaving little room for negotiation. Every home must conform to the established aesthetic. Your choice, however elegant in its inspiration, does not meet our standards. The word struck Jonathan like a blow, particularly because they seemed to disregard the meticulous care he had taken in every step of his construction. Undeterred, Jonathan countered that the municipal codes and the approved permits had explicitly allowed for a range of colors, including the shade he had chosen. He cited specific clauses and presented historical data showing that previous projects in the neighborhood had even employed similar hues. Yet Veronica persisted, inflexible in her interpretation of the rules. Her insistence was less about legality and more about an unyielding belief in conformity, a belief that left no room for individual expression. The meeting soon devolved into a standoff of principles. Other board members watched silently, caught between their duty to enforce community standards and the growing murmurs of discontent from the audience. Residents who once admired the board's dedication to community cohesion now exchanged skeptical looks as they saw Jonathan's well-documented arguments clash with Veronica's uncompromising stance. What began as a procedural review turned into a battle for the soul of the community. Jonathan's calm determination and rational evidence were met with rigid dogma, an insistence on aesthetic uniformity that seemed arbitrary in light of the actual regulations. The meeting room buzzed with tension, every resident sensing that this dispute was more than a mere technicality. As the meeting wore on, it became increasingly clear that no compromise would be easily reached. Veronica Mills maintained her stern demeanor, her tone growing increasingly defensive as she reiterated that rules were rules and that exceptions, no matter how well documented, could not be entertained. For Jonathan, the standoff represented not just a personal affront, but a symbolic battle between free expression and authoritarian control. In that charged atmosphere, Jonathan realized that this meeting was a turning point. If the board could not appreciate the factual basis of his appeal, then the issue would escalate beyond administrative redress. The room, filled with murmurs of support from concerned residents, bore witness to a growing collective unease about inflexible rule enforcement in their community. With his evidence meticulously displayed before a skeptical assembly, Jonathan left the meeting with a heavy heart but a firmer resolve. He understood that this public confrontation was only the beginning of a larger struggle, a struggle that would demand not only personal courage but also the support of every homeowner who believed in fairness, transparency, and the right to express individuality. The seeds of resistance had been sown in that contentious hall, and as the residents dispersed, whispers of change and reform began to ripple through the community. The standoff at the association meeting set a volatile tone for what was to come. A few weeks later, Jonathan Mercer's dreams of a peaceful life on his ancestral acres were violently shattered. One crisp morning, as he surveyed the nearly completed villa, Jonathan noticed commotion near the property's edge. A group of workers, hired by the Homeowners Advisory Association, had arrived with equipment in tow. Their task was as chilling as it was unexpected, the demolition of his legally constructed villa. Without warning, heavy machinery rumbled onto the scene. Cranes and bulldozers, their engines roaring, were positioned to dismantle the very structure that had been designed and built with impeccable adherence to every rule and permit. Jonathan rushed outside, his heart pounding as he saw workers beginning to tear down parts of the facade, the modern lines of his home starting to crumble before his eyes. In that moment of chaos, Jonathan's training and authority as a law enforcement officer kicked in. With a commanding voice, he ordered the demolition crew to halt immediately. His words cut through the clamor like a clarion call. This villa, his personal tribute to memory and perseverance, would not be destroyed on the whims of an overreaching association. As the machinery ground to a reluctant halt, Jonathan turned his attention to the individuals responsible for orchestrating the demolition. Standing at the forefront was Veronica Mills, the same board representative who had dismissed his objections during the earlier meeting. Flanking her was another board member, now reintroduced as Theodore Collins, whose support for the draconian measures had been equally unyielding. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he confronted them. "You have overstepped every legal and ethical boundary," he stated sternly. "I will not allow you to impose your arbitrary will by destroying a home built in full compliance with the law." His tone left no doubt that this was no longer a dispute over paint colors or aesthetic guidelines, it was a full-blown challenge to authority. Veronica's face, once so confident behind the board's polished veneer, now contorted with a mix of indignation and fear. Theodore Collins stood rigid, unable to muster a defense against Jonathan's undeniable command. With calm precision, Jonathan signaled for backup from local law enforcement. Within minutes, officers arrived to secure the scene, ensuring that the halted demolition would be preserved as evidence of the association's overreach. The confrontation unfolded rapidly. Jonathan personally apprehended Veronica and Theodore on charges ranging from criminal trespass to property damage. Each arrest was executed with the precision of a man who understood that he was not only defending his own rights but also those of every homeowner in the community who might one day face similar tyranny. As the arrests were processed, the demolition crew slowly dispersed, leaving behind a scene frozen in time, a house in mid-demolition, halted by the force of justice. Among onlookers, residents watched with bated breath. Some cheered, relieved to see a man standing up for what was right, while others remained silent, uncertain of the storm that was brewing. Jonathan, despite the chaos, maintained his composure and dignity. He explained to the gathered neighbors that this action was a necessary stand against an abuse of power that threatened the very fabric of their community. As the early afternoon sun cast long shadows over the site, Jonathan's firm interventions marked a turning point in the conflict. His decisive actions not only stopped a senseless demolition in its tracks but also sent a clear message: no association, however powerful, was above the law. The unfolding events that day would reverberate throughout the community, igniting debates about authority, justice, and the right of individuals to control their own property. That dramatic stand against demolition laid the groundwork for what would soon become a citywide, and even national, conversation about property rights, the limits of communal governance, and the abuse of discretionary power by those in charge. For Jonathan Mercer, the battle was far from over, but on that day, he had defended not just his home but the principle that truth and legal integrity must always prevail. In the chaotic aftermath of the halted demolition, the events at Jonathan Mercer's property rapidly escalated into a spectacle that transcended the borders of his quiet community. With local law enforcement on the scene and the dramatic arrests of Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins, the confrontation was captured by multiple cameras, both by official agencies and by vigilant onlookers using smartphones. The footage, raw and unfiltered, quickly found its way onto social media, igniting a firestorm of public interest. Within hours, the video clips depicting Jonathan's resolute stand against the unauthorized demolition and his subsequent arrests went viral. The images of heavy machinery suspended mid-operation, and of a determined lawman cutting down the overreach of community authority, resonated deeply with viewers everywhere. Comments and shares multiplied as the story spread from local neighborhood groups to citywide discussions, and then to national news networks. For many, Jonathan Mercer was no longer just a private citizen fighting an isolated bureaucratic error. He had become a symbol of resistance against arbitrary power. The narrative was clear. A man, armed only with facts and unyielding resolve, stood up against an institution bent on controlling personal property through selective rule enforcement. The incident fueled debates on social media about the limits of homeowners' associations, the abuse of power by those wielding it, and concerns about racial undertones and systemic discrimination, issues that many felt were at the heart of the entire debacle. News outlets soon picked up the story, heralding Jonathan's actions as emblematic of a broader societal struggle. Editorials argued that the video had exposed not only the fallacies in the association's policies but also the inherent bias that seemed to underpin their enforcement. A wave of interviews, talk show segments, and panel discussions followed. Community leaders and legal experts debated whether the HOA's actions were a breach of property rights and civil liberties, calling for immediate reforms and transparency in community governance. Jonathan found himself thrust into the spotlight, a reluctant hero whose calm demeanor under pressure quickly won him widespread support. In interviews, he reiterated that his primary motivation was simple: to protect his home, a sanctuary built in complete compliance with every lawful regulation, and to ensure that no other resident would have to endure a similar assault on their rights. His measured words resonated with many who had felt marginalized by what they saw as the unchecked authority of local associations. As the video continued to circulate, a collective uprising began to take shape among local residents. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak out against the HOA found the courage to share their own stories of arbitrary fines and overzealous regulation. Community meetings were convened, where residents discussed plans for legal action and strategies to pressure the association into meaningful reform. What was once a solitary stand by a single homeowner was evolving into a broad movement demanding accountability and respect. The viral nature of the footage also led to a surge in legal inquiries. Civil rights lawyers, property rights advocates, and watchdog groups offered their support, promising to investigate the HOA's practices further. Rumors of state-level inquiries and legislative proposals began to circulate, as the public outcry reinforced the idea that such abuse of power had no place in a fair and just society. Throughout this media frenzy, Jonathan maintained his focus. Despite the attention and the pressure that accompanied it, he continued to emphasize that this was not about personal glory but about preserving the rights of every individual in the community. His unyielding resolve served as both a reminder and an inspiration, a clarion call that no one should have to surrender their legal rights or dignity at the hands of bureaucratic overreach. In the days that followed, as the media storm grew louder and the social discourse more impassioned, Jonathan Mercer's confrontation remained a potent symbol of justice. The video, now a permanent reminder of the day when a single act of defiance captured the hearts of thousands, would go on to influence public policy debates and inspire similar actions in communities across the country. The viral confrontation had indeed transformed a local dispute into a national conversation about power, fairness, and the inherent rights of every homeowner. Following the turbulent events of the viral confrontation, the repercussions for the Homeowners Advisory Association, HOA, began to unfold rapidly. In the immediate wake of the halted demolition and the dramatic arrests of Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins, legal action emerged as the next pivotal battleground. For Marshal Jonathan Mercer, this wasn't merely a personal vendetta. It was a mission to correct a systemic injustice that had reverberated throughout his community. The first step was to bring in legal counsel. Jonathan, with the support of concerned neighbors, contacted a seasoned attorney well-versed in property and civil rights law. In their consultations, every detail was scrutinized, from the meticulous permits and construction documents that validated his villa's legitimacy to the recorded video evidence of the unauthorized demolition crew and the ensuing chaos. Together, they prepared a comprehensive legal strategy aimed at not only seeking redress for the property damage but also addressing the emotional distress inflicted upon him and his fellow residents. As lawsuits were filed against the HOA and its board members, the legal documents painted a damning portrait of a system that had abused its power. The filings outlined accusations ranging from property damage and wrongful demolition to emotional distress and civil rights violations. The narrative that emerged was stark and uncompromising. A governing body had, under the guise of aesthetic regulation, inflicted measurable harm on a law-abiding citizen and had trampled on the rights of homeowners in the process. The legal proceedings also galvanized the community. Residents who had once quietly endured arbitrary fines or felt too intimidated to speak out now found their voices. Community organizers quickly mobilized, holding town hall meetings and public forums to discuss the merits of the case and explore avenues for further action. These gatherings became a crucible for community solidarity, a place where shared grievances transformed into collective empowerment. Neighbors exchanged stories of similar experiences, many recounted subtle forms of harassment that they had attributed to bureaucratic overreach and bias. In one particularly impassioned meeting at the local community center, a group of homeowners demanded that the HOA be held accountable for its actions. Their speeches were filled with both anger and hope, a call to restore dignity to what had been a community marred by fear and arbitrary rulings. Sensing the magnitude of the public sentiment, local media began to cover the legal saga extensively. Interviews with impacted residents and community leaders painted a picture of a grassroots movement that refused to let injustice slide. For Jonathan Mercer, the legal battle was as much about enforcing the rule of law as it was about affirming a fundamental right, the right of every homeowner to enjoy their property without undue interference. As the case gathered momentum, civil rights organizations and legal advocacy groups lent their support. Their endorsements not only added credibility to the lawsuit but also helped spread awareness about the broader issues at stake. Issues of discrimination, abuse of power, and the erosion of individual freedoms by overreaching associations. As the litigation proceeded, court hearings became a focal point for community activism. Jonathan, ever the calm and resolute figure, took the stage to testify about his experiences. His testimony, underscored by clear evidence and a steadfast commitment to justice, resonated with both the judge and the gathered public. In his statements, he emphasized that this was not a fight against a particular individual, but rather a stand against an entire system that allowed for arbitrary enforcement and selective rule application. The legal process was arduous and complex, involving multiple hearings, testimonies, and the painstaking examination of hundreds of documents. But as the case continued to unfold, it began to yield promising signs of accountability. The mounting evidence not only fortified Jonathan's claims but also ignited a fervor among community members who saw the lawsuit as a turning point, a necessary step toward ensuring that no homeowner would ever again be subjected to such unwarranted aggression. Though the legal battles were fraught with challenges, the sense of purpose within the community grew stronger with every passing day. Marshal Jonathan Mercer and the coalition of affected homeowners had lit a spark that promised to burn away the corruption and restore trust in local governance. With each court date, every public hearing, and every piece of evidence laid bare, the movement for justice gathered more momentum, a momentum that would ultimately redefine the relationship between homeowners and the associations meant to serve them. When the trial finally commenced, it signified more than just the adjudication of a single case. It was a watershed moment for the entire community. In the courtroom, the spotlight shone on the stark disparities between lawful conduct and the arbitrary actions of the Homeowners Advisory Association, HOA. Marshal Jonathan Mercer, who had become an emblem of resistance, prepared to testify amidst a sea of expectant faces, including those of the accused board members, Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Prosecution attorneys methodically laid out the case with clear evidence, detailed records of permits and approvals, meticulously compiled photographs, and, most compellingly, the viral video footage capturing the abrupt halt of the demolition. Witness after witness took the stand, each recounting experiences of what they now termed abusive regulation. Their testimonies resonated with an undercurrent of frustration, a long-standing grievance with a system that had allowed certain individuals to wield disproportionate power. At the heart of the trial was the issue of selective rule enforcement. It emerged that the HOA's stringent practices were not uniformly applied. Testimonies revealed how some homeowners received leniency while others, especially those from minority backgrounds, were subjected to unduly harsh penalties. The case transcended property disputes and delved into the realm of civil rights. Jonathan's calm and precise testimony, delivered with unwavering conviction, painted a damning portrait of a system rife with bias and arbitrary decision-making. Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins, attempting to defend their actions, offered half-hearted justifications that crumbled under the weight of incontrovertible evidence. Their arguments, centered on the need for community uniformity, failed to address the documented irregularities and the clear emotional toll their enforcement measures had inflicted on residents. Throughout the proceedings, it became evident that the actions of the HOA board members were less about preserving aesthetic harmony and more about imposing control through fear and discrimination. As the trial progressed, the judge acknowledged the gravity of the infractions. The verdict, when it was finally delivered, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Both Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins were found guilty of criminal trespass, property damage, and inciting unrest. The sentencing was severe. Fines, mandatory community service, and compulsory sensitivity training were imposed as measures to prevent a recurrence of such abuses. For the community, the ruling was both vindicating and a call to action. Their voices had been heard, and their insistence on fairness had prevailed. In the aftermath of the trial, a palpable shift occurred within the community. Public discussions turned toward repairing the deep-seated mistrust in local governance and instituting reforms that would ensure transparency and accountability moving forward. Jonathan Mercer emerged as a leader in this renewed push for reform. With his exemplary conduct during the trial, he inspired many to advocate for changes that would prevent any future concentration of power within the HOA. Community meetings and town halls, once filled with reluctant whispers of compliance, now buzzed with passionate debates on the rule of law, equal treatment, and civic responsibility. Activists, legal experts, and concerned residents came together to draft proposals for amending the bylaws of the association. Their goal was clear: to dismantle the structures that had allowed such selective enforcement and to establish a more equitable system of governance. The trial had not only reaped justice for a single case, it had ignited a broader call for systemic change. As the courtroom doors closed on that tumultuous day, the seeds of a revolution in community governance were firmly sown. Jonathan Mercer's unwavering pursuit of truth had exposed the underbelly of an institution meant to protect homeowners, setting the stage for reforms that would echo in every corner of the community. In the months that followed the trial, the impact of the verdict resonated throughout the community like a clarion call for change. The conviction of board members Veronica Mills and Theodore Collins marked a decisive moment in the struggle for fairness, a moment that spurred sweeping reforms within the Homeowners Advisory Association, HOA. Under mounting public pressure and the clear mandate of the court, the HOA leadership was compelled to re-evaluate its policies and governance practices. A series of urgent reforms were initiated. The association amended its bylaws to ensure that rules were applied uniformly and with due regard for individual homeowners' rights. A diversity committee was established to oversee future decisions, ensuring that the voices of all residents, regardless of background, were heard and respected. Furthermore, the previous management, whose practices had allowed unchecked power, was replaced with a team dedicated to transparency and accountability. For Marshal Jonathan Mercer, the victory was deeply personal. The villa he had built with love and resilience, once threatened by arbitrary enforcement, now stood as a symbol of triumph over injustice. His home became a beacon of hope in a community that had suffered enough under the heavy hand of misused authority. Residents often gathered in the communal garden adjacent to his property, discussing plans for future civic engagement and celebrating the newfound unity that had emerged from their shared ordeal. Local media continued to follow the story, portraying Jonathan's rebuilt home as a monument to perseverance and the power of collective action. Public figures, inspired by the community's journey from suppression to empowerment, spoke out in support of broader legislative measures to protect property rights and prevent discrimination in local governance. As the association worked to rebuild its reputation, many residents expressed gratitude for the courage and determination of one man who had dared to challenge an oppressive system. Jonathan Mercer's steadfast stand had not only safeguarded his personal haven but had also paved the way for a more just and equitable future. His story was now etched in local lore, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming authority, the spirit of resilience and the pursuit of justice can spark lasting change. In this new era, as the HOA operated under reformed regulations and community oversight, Willow Acres flourished. The villa, once a battleground, became a sanctuary of hope, a living testament to the power of unity in overcoming tyranny. For Jonathan Mercer and his fellow residents, the journey from conflict to reform was complete, a new beginning born from the ashes of injustice.